I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and if you're a subscriber, you might be wondering why I look like I've been punched in the face. Well, it wasn't easy to fight the other motoring journalists off the buttercream-coloured Hyundai Inster behind me, but you should see the other guy. Now, in this review, there's going to be two big takeaways. One, Hyundai has a new managing director here in Australia who has had the bravery to say Hyundai's not going to be able to compete with new Chinese brands directly on price, and they're going to ask Australians to pay more for their cars than new entrants from the PRC. Why? Well, this guy says Hyundai provides assurance to its customers that if this car breaks down, Hyundai will always be here to help, whereas some of those new manufacturers won't survive. And in fact, some old manufacturers won't survive either. How true is that? Well, only time will tell, but it's certainly interesting. Second point, and it's really related to the first, the car behind me is the start of Hyundai's fight back against those Chinese brands at the bottom end of the market. Cars like the BYD Dolphin, the MG3 and electric MG4, this is the Hyundai Inster. Starts from 39 grand before on-road costs, so not super cheap. Is there a universe in which you should spend kind of up to $10,000 more on an electric Hyundai Inster instead of a low-end Chinese electric car? Well, we're going to investigate that question in today's video, so make sure you stick around, hit subscribe down below, and let's get into it.
Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
The Insta's problem is that while it has a dependable badge at $39,000 before on-road costs, it's up to 9 grand more than a BYD Dolphin, which is a bit average to drive, and 7 grand more than a GWM Ora, which is very average indeed. But any car people watching will know that it's the solid and good to drive $36,990 drive away MG4 Excite 51 that is the biggest headache. So can the Insta convince us that it's worth more?
Well, the argument starts inside the Insta, where the cabin is obviously on the compact side. This vehicle is about 3.8 meters long, under 1.7 meters wide, which is really quite small. But the cabin is functionally laid out, extremely well packaged because of the electric nature of this vehicle. Everything's been able to be pushed to the corners and there's a flat floor. So as you can see, you could even walk across the front if you wanted to. More important to me though is that the ergonomics are brilliant. Seat comfort's okay, but all of the key controls fall right to hand. You've got clear buttons for climate and media. You've got crisp 10.25-inch screens, two of them right here, a steering wheel with physical controls, real wiper and indicator stalks, and the software in this car is surprisingly good. Hyundai have gotten their own infotainment system to a good level, plus we have the full BlueLink smartphone companion app connectivity in this car, online networking in the system, wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and even the basic stereo in this car actually sounds kind of acceptable, which is good. Now this one, as I said, is 39 grand plus on-road costs, and you're looking at a sort of dark grey cloth interior for that price and 15-inch wheels outside, but you are getting things like climate control, LED headlights and tail lights for that money, and a full safety suite as well, including strong adaptive cruise and lane keeping. Now you can spend another 3.5 grand to get about an extra 50 kilometers of real-world range. You get a slightly bigger battery, you get 17-inch wheels outside, and most importantly to me, you get the option of an incredible houndstooth cloth interior, which just looks mint. Then for 45 grand, there's an Insta Cross, which doesn't get dual motors, but it kind of looks a bit tougher outside with SUV cladding, and you can choose a sunroof and a roof box. Plus you get things like fake leather with heating and cooling if you care about stuff like that. But for most people, the 39 grand special is going to be enough Insta. Amazing visibility out of this box. You can see the roof is tall, so tall people will be well accommodated by this car. Storage space is pretty decent too. Cup holders down here, loads of open storage beneath the stack here, some shelving over on this side, 12-volt socket, 3 USB ports, nice little details like this armrest that folds down here. Really kind of reminds me of that Japanese K-car style of motoring, not something we've seen heaps of here in Australia. But you know what? I kind of like it. This is a really cool second car, or maybe if you have the world's smallest garage, it could be your first car. But certainly the interior works as you'd expect, nothing weird about it, and I like that. Let's go to row 2. Row 2 is where the Insta suddenly becomes quite mind-bending because despite being one of the very smallest new cars available today in Australia, it is apparently sized like a mid-size SUV in the back. And that is because, firstly, that electric packaging pushed right to the corners, flat floor kind of gives an extra illusion of space, but it's also the sliding and reclining second row. So you can see I can pull the bar down here, I can bring it right forward, I can bring it right back. And if it's right back, that means the boot space is very minimal, but the second row legroom is exceptional, or you can reduce the legroom to have more boot space. It's completely up to you. As well as the sliding, you can reach behind you and you can recline the seat surprisingly far too. It is also only a 4-seater, so you will not get someone legally into the middle here, nor will you find loads of plush materials. It is built to a price, even though that price isn't that cheap, you won't go finding heaps of soft materials. There's a little bit of padding down here, no armrests in the center, no air vents. There are air bags back here though, which is mildly reassuring. Mostly it's about heaps of space, and that is what Insta surprisingly gives you in the back. Moving around the back of the Insta now, I want to try and give you an idea of how large this car really isn't. And probably the closest vehicle on the road would be the Suzuki Ignis. So if you've seen those around and about, you'll know the dimensions. Also quite similar to the Mitsubishi Mirage, smaller than vehicles like the Mazda 2 and the Volkswagen Polo, particularly in the width, which is really skinny and why this vehicle is only a 4-seater. As you can see, we've got the pixel design that Hyundai typically deploys on its electric vehicles. I'm a fan. Obviously, the appearance is odd, but I kind of like that. When you do this job and you mostly spend your time in, mid-size SUV, XYZ and dual cab utes, cars like this are a bit weird and I love that. Anyway, open up the manual tailgate. You've got between about 280 and 350 litres of space, and that's because that rear seat slides and reclines, and the boot goes from comically tiny to kind of usable, particularly because it actually has a false floor and it's quite deep underneath there, no spare wheel, and because this vehicle has sort of space-saving torsion beam rear suspension and no rear motor, they can go quite deep in the boot. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. There's no frunk in this vehicle, not normally expected in a size like this anyway. So are you going to be able to move house in the Insta? Probably not, but for daily duties, it's pretty fine.
Where the lightweight Insta claws background is in its low running costs. Efficiency is an absolute standout. I managed 11 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers in town without trying very hard from the 46 kilowatt hour extended range, and about 12 kilowatt hours per 100 on country roads with the 39 kilowatt hour version. On the highway, expect 15 or 16, particularly considering a full charge at home would only cost you about $18. Just wish it used an LFP battery so you could charge it to 100% all the time without worrying. Servicing is required every 2 years or 30,000 kilometers, and each 2-year stop costs $655. The warranty is currently 5 years with unlimited kilometers, but Hyundai is about to move to a 7-year unlimited kilometer guarantee. But don't worry, that will be backdated to all 2025 cars, we understand.
All right, time to take the Hyundai Insta for a drive and see what this little electric SUV/hatch is really like on Australian roads. And this is a Hyundai that has gone through an Australian ride and handling assessment. And I think that's probably a good idea because when you look at the fundamentals, we do have a relatively long wheelbase in this car, which is the sort of thing which is good for stability. But the track is very, very narrow. And so you're really asking a lot of the suspension for things like road holding. And, if you're watching from Australia, you'll know that we have a bunch of rough roads and little cars often don't like them. One thing the Insta, of course, has in its favor is that it's not as light as a petrol-powered light car, which would usually be around the sort of 1,000 kilogram mark. The Insta is about 1,350 kilos, which is incredibly light for an EV, but it does give you a little bit more of that weight low down just to settle the car. So the base battery is 42 kilowatt hours, about 39 usable, or you can spend $3,500 more on a 49 kilowatt hour battery, a little bit less than that in terms of usable capacity. The small battery has 71 kilowatts of power and 147 newton meters of torque, so fairly modest outputs. The big battery, if you can call it that, ups the power to 84 kilowatts, but the torque remains the same. 0 to 100 is about 10 seconds for the big battery, about 11 seconds for the small battery. So certainly the Insta is not a vehicle which is going to light the world on fire in terms of acceleration. But what those numbers don't tell you is how rapid the 0 to 50 kilometer per hour acceleration is. This vehicle is more at home in the city and also on kind of curving country roads than it is on the highway, where you do notice that it runs out of puff at triple digits. How does that compare to the Chinese competition? Well, vehicles like the cheapest BYD Dolphin are similar to the Insta in terms of performance and power output, but something like a base MG4 has 125 kilowatts of power and 250 newton meters of torque, and that's a vehicle that is occasionally offered for sale in sort of the mid-30s drive away. So certainly that feels much stronger in terms of performance than the Insta. But now we come to something the Hyundai does right that the competition often does wrong, and that is ride and handle correctly. What I mean by correctly is that the body control is normal, the damping is normal, the steering feel is normal. It's simply that its handling responses have been well tuned, carefully calibrated, and odd responses have been dialed out from the chassis of this car. Now, the MG4 is pretty good on those measures as well. That is a bigger car, sometimes cheaper, as I've mentioned, but swap from an Insta into a BYD Dolphin, and that's where you start to notice the additional tuning nous of Hyundai's chassis gurus. And that isn't just a line from the brochure or a bit of marketing. It fully translates into how the car reacts to the inputs that you put through the steering wheel and what you get from the dampers as you traverse bumps. The Insta rides pretty well for a small car that is short and narrow. You do notice the bigger bumps and the bigger imperfections coming into the cabin, and it doesn't ride as well on 17-inch wheels. But you will be surprised, particularly if you do some country touring, that the Insta actually feels surprisingly at home. Likewise, in town, it soaks up the cut and thrust of traffic really well. The steering doesn't have much road feel to it, but the ratio running through it is intuitive. It's very smooth, and the front wheels do precisely what you expect. Likewise, the safety systems are well calibrated. You can quiet the speed warning bongs now by holding down the mute button on the steering wheel, which is a new feature for Hyundais and much needed. But things like the lane keep assist are not always being triggered by phantom sights of cars or lane markings around you. Partially, the narrow width of the Insta helps too, because you're not actually coming close to lane markings. The adaptive cruise control is very smooth and isn't triggering false positives as you get down the road. So the argument here from Hyundai is that yes, you are paying more for the Insta, but what you're getting is a vehicle that is properly finished and ready for the Australian buying public. Now, that's not to say that all cheap Chinese cars are badly made or badly tuned, because there are certainly good ones out there. But not all of them are, and in fact, not all cars from non-Chinese brands are well tuned and ready. But the Insta is a car that feels like it's had that final layer of polish applied. So what doesn't the Insta do well? Well, again, it could be faster. This chassis is actually pretty capable. I would have loved to have seen like a 100 kilowatt motor, which would give the Insta an old school hot hatch feel. Grip levels, particularly on the 15-inch wheels, are not amazing in the wet, so you do need to slow down a little bit going into fast corners on a country road. And then there's also things like seat comfort, which hasn't been adjusted for really long journeys, although that's probably not what the Insta is about. For most people, the Insta is going to be probably more relegated to town duties. Maybe you'll drive up the coast for an hour or two, maybe you'll take it to the beach, stuff like that. I'm not too concerned about the idea of driving from Sydney to Perth in a Hyundai Insta. You might have a different car in the garage for those sorts of duties if that's what you're into. Returning to my comments up front of this video, should you be spending more on an Insta than on a Chinese electric car? Well, I think there's an argument that you should. The Hyundai Insta at 39,000 plus on-road costs, that's going to be for somebody that doesn't want the absolute cheapest price, still wants good value for money, but wants a vehicle that feels very normal. The ride and handling of the Insta is well suited to Australian roads. Even though it's very narrow, which is quite unusual in this day and age, the handling of this car is well executed. It's solid to drive, it's comfortable, it steers the way you'd expect. The software works the way you would expect. It has the full BlueLink connectivity even on the base grade, something that the cheapest Chinese cars occasionally miss, for instance. The efficiency is exceptional. The real-world range approaches 400 kilometers from a small and light battery. They're the kinds of virtues that we really look for in a vehicle as a road tester. But as Hyundai's new CEO here in Australia openly says, you have to pay for some of those attributes. You have to pay for the fact that this car doesn't feel cobbled together and random. So the question is really over to you. Do you think the Insta is worth what Hyundai is charging? Or would you be holding out and hoping for some kind of drive-away deal on this vehicle in future? I want to see your feedback down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell if you've enjoyed this independent review of the Insta. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.